But welcome to all of you. I was a little worried we'd be speaking to the tables, the chairs, and the hotel staff. But the hotel staff doesn't seem to be too interested, actually, so here we are. Well, let's see if the technology will work. The greening effect of transit. I'm actually not going to talk about Salt Lake City. So since you brought it up, I'm very briefly going to tell you, we've gone through a major transit renaissance in my city. The city of 2 million people. 10 years ago, we had no rail transit. Today, we have close to 300 kilometers of rail, 100 miles. I know it in miles better than I know it in kilometers. For some reason, we stuck with the archaic British system of measurement, so here we are. In any event, today we have close to 300 miles, or 150 miles, and it's been very, very successful. The interesting thing is the way we got to it. We did not listen to the politicians, we listened to the people. And I'm going to end my presentation with a little bit of a lesson about listening to the people. The people understand what they want, they understand what they don't have, and they understand what they need. I don't know why politicians don't ever listen to them. But fortunately, there are those of us in this room who move forward with things like public transit, even though the politicians don't always seem to be listening. So my primary message here is going to be about the greening effect of transit. In other words, from a macro level, why it's important that we have good public transit and the kinds of changes and things that are going on. I'm going to talk about the sustainability impacts, although they're obvious. I'm going to talk about land use issues, which for us in America is where we begin. We've got to solve land use issues and land use attitudes before we can really make things like public transit and sustainability actually work. We're going to talk about transit usage levels, new technology and energy sources, and there's some very interesting new things just out of the box. It's almost like the genie being let out of the box that are going to be, I think, driving the future of public transit in a very positive direction. And I'm going to talk about active transportation, which we all ought to be involved in. As I look at this group, which has been very sedentary now for the last 2 days, we should all get out and rent one of those shared bicycles out there and be riding around London for the rest of the afternoon. And I'm going to talk about that and how important that is from a number of perspectives, both from a public transit point of view as well from a health point of view. So let's start here. We know what's been going on. Frankly, everybody has been joining me in their old age. And I don't understand it because I have more grandchildren than there are I and my wife. But you can see that we're basically crossing the line now. There are more people over the age of 66 and that gap is increasing than there are under the age of 5. I can't, coming from Utah, if you know anything about Utah, it's a little hard to understand that on a national level because Utah has the highest fertility rate in the United States. And so we have lots of children, but it doesn't seem to be the case in the rest of the developed world. Here I'm talking about the developed world. The developing world, I think these factors are actually quite different. We've also seen a very real trend to urban population growth, even in my city, which is, a lot of people think of Utah as out west as a rural place. It's not. 2 million people consolidated in a very narrow corridor with actually severe environmental problems. But we can see that rural populations are flattening out, urban populations are growing. Again, not necessarily what's happening in the underdeveloped parts of the world. And I just like what this said. Populations increase, but the planet doesn't. We're not growing more land, we're not growing more air, we're not growing a lot of things that we need for sustainability and for survival. And you can see here, there is a huge disparity across this globe in the consumption of energy. I had the particular privilege of attending the Copenhagen Global Warming Conference this was about 3 years ago, I think it was, something like that. Fascinating experience because there I was exposed suddenly to the fact that my nation had consumed a lot of the world's energy and created a lot of the problems, and the rest of the world had figured that out, and we're beginning to wonder what we're going to do about it, and we don't have an answer for that because the rest of the world wants to grow, wants to It wants to be like the developed world, but it's going to be very difficult for them given the environmental issues that are already created, are already in motion. May even have something to do with this beautiful weather we're having outside here right now. I'm not sure. But you can see in Houston, typical, and this is a typical American city, a large American city, we're using more energy than almost any other place in the world to move our people around. And I don't think that is a sustainable lifestyle. And there's some things that will need to be done to change that. This is Albuquerque. How many of you know where Albuquerque is? Albuquerque, New Mexico, out west. A nice city. This is the parking area. This property in downtown Albuquerque is consumed by parking. So that doesn't leave a lot of room for housing and retail and commercial space. It's all consumed by parking. I think this is a very interesting graph, but I think if you went into most, especially most middle-sized American cities, and I'm thinking of a middle-sized American city as anything less than 2 million people, and probably more likely below 1 million, you would find this same exact pattern. The darker ones are, of course, high-rise parking garages. The rest of them are surface parking lots, and they're probably all full in the middle of the day in the city of Albuquerque even. This is my city, beautiful city, down in the mountains, surrounded by this beautiful, as most people think, pristine air. If you go up this canyon right here, you get into some of the greatest skiing on earth, truly is. And it looks just gorgeous, except 100 days out of the year you cannot see that scene because it's covered with pollution, smog. This is a bowl. These mountains ring this entire area. Get a little of the wrong kind of temperature inversion, and you can have some very dirty air in this valley, in this beautiful valley. And there's not a lot we can do about it without dealing with transportation. In order to deal with transportation, we've really got to deal with land use. Some time ago, we did an interesting thing in our community. We said, are we going to just keep on doing this? Just let it happen to us. Let the air get worse. Not deal with the future. Let our grandkids sort it out for themselves. And being the kind of community we are, we decided that was not the answer, that we needed to step up and begin to solve the issues of the future. In fact, begin to address the issues that our grandchildren will face in the future. I'm at that age where grandchildren mean a lot to me. And I look around the room here, most of you are in that middle age where you haven't got any grandchildren yet, but you will soon have them, and you'll realize how important grandchildren are. And for me, that's what the rest of my life should really be about, and many in my community feel the same. So we're going to have 1 million more residents by 2030. We're already 2 million. We're urbanizing 87% more land. We need water. If we continue to have the kind of weather we're having on a regular basis now in Utah, our water comes from the mountains. It comes from snow, and if it snows a little and turns warm and melts a lot, we have a water problem, especially with another 1 million people coming. We've got problems with air pollution, as I described. We've got big problems with crowding and congestion because we live in a narrow, it's called the Wasatch Front. It's a very narrow area for development. It's about 10 to 15 miles at the widest and about 150 miles in its length. And so everyone is concentrated. In fact, it's a very urban area, a very dense area in a way. That means increasing costs for businesses and families and rising infrastructure needs. So where do we start? We've got to start. The smart people sat down in a room like this and said, where do we begin? And they concluded they had to begin with land use, what we're doing with our land. For a long time, the attitude has been just sprawl, sprawl, sprawl. You know, we all want a ranch, let's all have a ranch. We all want to live on, a half acre, and it doesn't matter because we've got cheap gasoline and good highways and we can drive all we want as far as we want. And it became a kind of a joke that you drove to qualify for a home loan. That meant that the further out you went, the cheaper the property values were, the less your mortgage would be. And so if you could contend with driving for an hour into the city, working in the city, and living out in the outer limits of the city, you could qualify for a loan and get a bigger home out there. And a lot of people, the development patterns followed that issue. But as we began to look at these issues, this is the urbanized area, as I was talking about, the Wasatch Front. On the far right is sprawling. It's a little hard to see. Hopefully you can see the differentiation between each of these scenarios. Scenario A, though, what's happening there? You can see it's sprawl as usual. And if I were to blow that up, you could really see some real serious differences between this one, which is a little less sprawl, and this one is a lot less sprawl. These are models that were developed to look at the impacts that sprawl was having on our community. This one basically says infill. Let's quit leaving open spaces between us and the next place. In fact, let's not allow the next place. This has certainly political implications about land use and control and developers and the usual political elements that all go with that. But this is the one we began to look at very, very hard. And this one here pushes the envelope a little bit, a lot of more than infilling, actually a level of densification that was not being experienced when these models were put together. Now, one would expect that if the community were asked which model they ought to follow, they would pick this one because that's what they were doing. Not so, because we began to talk about the implications of each of these models, A, B, C, and D. Housing types change, fewer single-family dwelling units, much more consolidation. Land consumption goes down significantly, and a lot of the land that's being consumed by houses is not too bad agricultural land, and we see population densities going up. One interesting thing that comes out of a study of these models is how critical public transit becomes. You can't serve a densifying kind of economic development system with a highway and freeway infrastructure. You've got to move to much more public transit to make it work. And the net effect of that is a significant reduction in emissions. Vehicle miles traveled, of course, go down. And interestingly, water demand goes down because now we don't have those great big lawns that we have to water. And so it starts, this approach begins to solve some of the problems that the community was facing. But the most important element to come out of these models was the most convincing. And that is, if you keep growing the way we're growing, it's going to cost $37 billion over a 20-year period. If we consolidate in either one of these C and D levels, we save $15 billion in infrastructure investment. And that's just the tip of the iceberg. That was a compelling message to both elected officials and our local community leaders who said, we haven't got that money to spend. We have a lot of children we need to educate, for example, and that money would be much better spent on education for our growing young population. Interestingly, the public had a chance, in a sense, to do a vote on this, and look where they landed. What this did, that result, which is really surprising and quite overwhelming, but it said to our elected leadership, you have tall grass to hide in now. You can say you're doing what the public desires by following a much, much more straightforward limited growth policy, and that's what's happened in our community. Now, the nature of Utah being very conservative doesn't mean we went out and imposed these rules on everyone, but the local government leaders got together and began to set some standards, began to adopt zoning ordinances and measures to control this growth, and begin to work together in concert. And one more thing they did, they began to develop public transit systems that would serve this more consolidated growth level. One big thing that came out of this is an agreement to put 1/3 of our future homes, jobs, and stores on 3% of the land. And that's happening right now in our valley. Large tracts are being developed. They're being developed in a consolidated way, following LEED's environmental standards, and we're now beginning to see some serious changes in our community. One of the things that happened was the complete redevelopment of the Central Business District. It had grown up like many central business districts across the country with two big shopping malls who really fell out of favor 10 or 15 years ago, and the downtown area was becoming a pretty lifeless place other than in the middle of the day when the businesses were in operation there. The downtown area was completely torn down. I want you to keep in mind that the blocks you see on this map are 660 feet long. They're very long, very large blocks, so this is a very large area. All of the buildings in those sectors were completely torn down, clear to the basement, and the entire downtown area was redeveloped. It was possible because the entire downtown was essentially owned by one owner. the Mormon Church. and one entity in the nation that didn't get hit by the recession were, I assume, religious institutions, and particularly the Mormon Church. And so they had an extra $2 billion to spend on a complete remodeling of downtown Salt Lake City. It just opened last week. And how many of you here know what Nordstrom's is? No, you don't. Nordstrom's is a very high-end clothing store. Very, people from the rural areas actually take chartered airplanes to go to Nordstrom's. Well, in this complex, we now have the largest Nordstrom in the world, so we're taking a lot of credit for that. But what's more important is this is a mixed development, mixed housing, a lot of housing in downtown Salt Lake City now. It's mixed income levels. There's certainly the commercial and those other aspects. There's open space. There are fountains. There was a river. A river one day ran through here and they covered it up. It's now back above ground. It's called City Creek now, this whole development. And a 15,000 student population of one of the major universities in the West, Brigham Young University, is moving into downtown Salt Lake City now. The interesting thing is that the center of all of this activity is our light rail line, which was the first line we built and began to build about 10 years ago. So public transit has been and is an integral part of this development in our city today, and it's beginning to really pay off because we have a whole new life about downtown. The perimeter communities that had also become lifeless have now become the places that young families move and are rebuilding, are fixing up the homes. It's a very exciting time in our city. And it's all being supported by public transit. Frankly, this is what we're trying to avoid. I put this up here so that you'll wake up. This is shocking to see this. The highway people usually don't like me to show this, but I started my career as a highway engineer. I feel like I have some rights to saying something about this. Now, that's not to say Salt Lake City is not the only place in the U.S. that's doing these kinds of things. Throughout the U.S., there is a renaissance now in public transit. I took a survey for this Copenhagen thing and found out that in a 20-year period, we will spend in the United States close to $150 billion on public transit. That's rail transit infrastructure, and it's mostly in medium-sized cities out west. So we're doing our part. Transit usage levels, I wanted to talk about this a little bit because no matter how you cut it, at least when compared with a single occupancy vehicle, whether it's bus, heavy rail, light rail, commuter rail, van pools, doesn't matter. It's a more energy efficient and less polluting way to go. So the more of that we have in this world, the more sustainable we are. But even more importantly, the better we are at it. If our average bus does this with the average occupancy rate, look what it's capable of doing. We can do a better job. Many of you are probably already in that mode where you've got full seats on everything. But that's something we're aspiring to in the western United States. And then you start looking at the additional things you can do. If we just keep expanding our transit system the way we're doing it, we're going to have this kind of growth in ridership. But if we add 50% service to our current levels of service, we're going to see a significant increase in ridership levels. And if we add transit-oriented development, a whopping change. And we're now seeing a lot of transit-oriented development going around our stations to the effect that the state legislature, in an incredible shift of attitude about 3 years ago, made it possible for public transit agencies in my state to actually become partners with developers, subordinating public properties that are essentially properties owned around transit stations in a development deal that returns a return on investment to the private or to the public transit operator over the life of the lease of the property. This is a unique thing. You don't see it in very many places. I don't think you have it in Philadelphia, Joe, or anything like that. It's quite groundbreaking in its impact. But what it has done is it has made transit a much easier partner for developers because of the ability we have to share in the development of the projects. We've also got congestion pricing. If you start looking at that, and we're here at the home of congestion pricing, and then I'm going to talk a little later about bike and pedestrian active transportation, but I have to hurry. But consider another area that we're way missing out in the United States is high-speed rail, and it's unfortunate because it costs as much in energy just to lift a plane off the ground as it was to actually operate a light rail system between Las Vegas and Los Angeles. I mean, some real energy benefits deriving from this kind of technology development. And things are beginning to happen. That Los Angeles to Las Vegas is actually pretty much funded and in effect in operation. There's the Caltrains California system that's going. There's quite a few things that are happening, but we're way behind and have a lot of catch up. Unfortunately, in the current political environment in America, this has become known as an Obama issue, and so it's become very political and crazy. And so those of us who are high-speed rail advocates don't talk about it right now. We're waiting to get the craziness over with, and then we'll get back with the business of putting in high-speed rail lines around the U.S., but we do have a plan. New trends in technology. You know, it's interesting. I got this chart from General Motors. General Motors is studying this issue pretty intently and realizing that 80% of the people drive only 50 miles a day or less. You know, this chart has some implications about how automobiles ought to be designed. So 50% drive 25 miles a day or less. And 65% of all trips made under a mile in length are made in an automobile. That's under a mile. Yeah, I wonder why Americans are overweight. Well, this is the new automotive DNA. In fact, I share this with you. It's a little bit hot off the press, but they told me I could show this. They're looking at the old DNA for the automobile. It was energized by petroleum, powered mechanically, standalone, totally dependent on the driver. And by the way, it had to weigh a lot so that when we ran into each other, we couldn't get hurt. We would have a cocoon of steel around us. The new is energized by electricity and hydrogen, powered electrically, controlled electrically, connected, and semi or fully autonomous driving. And the vehicle would be tailored to specific use. That means it can be smaller, lighter. We don't need great big SUVs to drive the kids to the soccer game park. A lot of implications in how automobiles may be being redesigned and imagined for the future. This is V2I and V2V. Those are terms used in the U.S. now to describe systems where the vehicle itself becomes an active communicator with everything in its surrounding environment. It communicates to the street signs, it communicates to the curb, it communicates to everything. That's vehicle to infrastructure, and it communicates to all other the vehicles in its space. This is technology that's not being invented now. This is technology that actually works. We're demonstrating this at the demonstration levels right now, and most of the automobile manufacturers that I've been talking to are preparing for just this time when vehicles no longer need to be 3,000 pounds. They can be half that because it will be the system that will protect people from running into each other. Big implications for transit, and if we are careful, we become involved in this at an early phase and make sure we're being considered in this new technological development. I just found this intriguing. One of the problems I have is that our system will have 85% of the population within about 2 miles of a train station. And my worst nightmare is every morning when everybody gets up, fires up their SUV, and drives to the train station where we have just built a massive parking lot to park all of their cars. I'd much rather they come in this electric vehicle, which almost can fold up. We can park, 10 of them in the space. We can park one automobile, I think. And it's an area, interestingly, the automobile manufacturers, the smart ones, are beginning to look at. How do we help transit deal with the first and last mile? How do we get people there? There are other ways, there are more healthy ways to do it, but this is a way that's being seriously considered by automobile manufacturers for the future. And they want to be a part of transit, believe it or not. They're actually talking to us for a change instead of trying to put us out of business like they did a long time ago. This is another area, inductive power transfer. It is so hot that you may not have heard very much about it, but it is moving along very rapidly. And this basically, you take a bus, an airport shuttle bus, you put a very small battery pack in it, very lightweight. You use inductive charging, which now is 100 kilowatts to 250 kilowatts, 95% efficient, and can be simply buried in the asphalt, not even noticed, and is completely benign and safe when there's not a vehicle over it. This can operate that vehicle all day long in basically 30-minute shots. And the battery implications are no longer long storage life, but high rapid charge rates. So the technology is going to be changing in this area. It was one of the 50 best inventions of 2010. You're going to be hearing more about that. It's all in response to the energy situation we have, where most of us in the transit business, especially those of us who still operate a lot of buses, are at the mercy of fuel prices as they radically go up and down, and whatever they do, mostly up. Now finally, I'm going to talk about active transportation. Interesting, the factors here. As we look at the typical American and their concerns about obesity, we see that the trend in VMT, vehicle miles traveled, in the United States trends very closely to the increase in obesity in America. Now, I walked around London and I tried to count the people I thought were overweight. I didn't see very many in London, and I'm concluding that they have to walk a ways to get to the train station, and after they get off the train and different things. This is a very important area of our lives that are being messed up by our devotion to the automobile. This, I think, this is what we call active transportation. It's not spandex and shiny helmets, okay? Whenever I talk about active transportation to a crowd, I have to say this is not for the recreational biker. This is for the old guy like me who's going to get on his bike. He needs a basket, and he's not going to put on any silly clothes in order to ride to town, but he also doesn't want to ride in the street with those great big automobiles. Now, when we talk about an active transportation initiative, it's a comprehensive network of pedestrian and bicycle pathways. And this could also be pathways for people in wheelchairs, children going to school, but it's a completely separate pathway system that would be enabled by dedicated funding mechanisms, perhaps coming from the transit agencies, and would be overseen and operated by an institutional operator. And fully integrated with other modes. And I mentioned this earlier about how we're driving ourselves to death. You can see here, I'm just going to jump on. This was what I kind of wanted to end with. You can see here, this was some surveys that were done, and basically this is what the National Transportation Funding currently allocates funding to in the United States. Mostly roads, some public transit, and a little tiny bit of bike and pedestrian ways. Okay, the little recreational, throw them a bone. This is what the public responded to. The public sees a very different balance. And in my community, when I go out and talk about a bike and pedestrian network, and I'm not talking about a painted stripe down on the side of a highway, I'm talking about the construction of guideways and pathways that get people to transit stations primarily, that integrate them with the rest of the system. I get enormously positive response. And it's such good response, in the U.S., we have to do it this way, I can take this to a referendum and get enough votes to pass it, to pass a tax increase that will produce this. I'm very confident of that. So we're working on that right now and hoping to put together the first system in the U.S. with a fully integrated, institutionalized bike and pedestrian system. We'll see how it goes, and I'll come back sometime in the future and report. I'll ride my bike back. At the end of the day, this is what it's about. This is 3 of my 11 grandchildren. I have a duty to take care of their lives. It's my responsibility. I consumed my parents' contribution. It's now my job to make sure there's something left for them. Thank you.